Hey guys, welcome back to What the Fat. Today we have back on an amazing guest that you guys loved the first time. It's actually a crazy story. I didn't even realize this until you told me this, but it's been like exactly 1 year since the last time we recorded. So this must be a sign it's going to be an amazing episode.
It's our anniversary, Ryan. So.
Oh, this is great. This is great.
I didn't know till Instagram memories popped up, and I was like, "What? Yeah, what does this mean?" It's like a double rainbow.
It's the best sign ever. So, oh my gosh. So, Allie Miller, welcome back to the show. What's happened in the last year? Like obviously things aren't crazy busy. They're just super slow. You're not doing anything crazy. It's just, yeah, tell us what's really happening.
Yeah. So, a year ago's episode, we talked a lot about my background in functional medicine and what I do as a practitioner. And the anti-anxiety diet was just dropping at that time. It came out fall of 2018. And within the first 3 months of that, my publishers reached out to me to do the anti-anxiety diet cookbook, which comes out at the end of September 2019. So any day now, I swear. And that really unties the application and the strategy of the science of the anti-anxiety diet. It was really high level information and really well received. But I think that people were like, okay, I'm freaked out about leaky gut and I'm sipping bone broth, but what else? And so the anti-anxiety diet cookbook really unpacks a lot of application. It also opens up the world of how do we feed our toddlers and our children? Do they need to go full on ketogenic or do they just do a low glycemic approach? And what kind of limitations as well as abundant strategy should we have for kids? Because the anxiety concept transcribes to ADHD, autism, and any form of neurological condition, of course. And so it includes a whole section, an entire chapter on kids, which I was super excited to put together. And then there's a lot in there, which was the other kind of caveat need that a lot of my followers look to as women, is what's the role with carb cycling and leptin and what is metabolic flexibility? So this book really opens up that world of kind of taking off the blinders of a myopic approach to what keto is, this kind of black and white rigid plan, and explaining to the reader how they should really examine their own metabolic flexibility, what that looks like, and variables that would influence, how we metabolize carbs and what our upper and lower limit is.
Amazing. So I want to start with one of the things that you just mentioned, because I was just actually with someone this morning and they were talking about what they feed their kids. And I always point to you and the Vegas because I love like the approach, because they're like, I just can't get my kid to stop eating cereal and all this stuff. I'm like, listen, you need to follow Allie, you need to follow Danny and Mauda, and like just see it. Like I love how you guys, it's not a lot of times I think people get confused that like, oh, you're forcing your kid to eat a certain way, but you're leading by example. Like you're leading by example and you're giving them choices that are just healthy alternatives. Can you talk about some of that you talk about?
Yeah, I believe at an early age, even in utero process, your child starts to develop a palate based on the mother's diet. And breast milk, even prior to breastfeeding, we've seen based on placenta exchange that your diet, especially if you eat more alkaloid foods, more bitter compounds, more of a savory palate, and are limiting your sweeteners, that's going to have an influence on the child's palate and how they explore and are open to foods, as well as your parenting strategy, of course. And so I'm really big on leading with autonomy, even as early as the starting first foods, meaning, I waited with Stella and I'm a big proponent of baby-led weaning. So, I'm a big fan of a child knows hunger and satiety, and a child intuitively knows when they're ready for solids. I'm not a fan of purees and force feeding. I can't tell you how many times I'm like at Starbucks or wherever, and I see the mom like doing this spoon scrape and the force, and the baby's like looking the other way, and blah, like food just being shoved down their throat. Like that doesn't seem like a natural way to feed your child. If you were breastfeeding, the child releases when they're done. They're satiated, tank's full, good. So the force feed thing, I think, creates a little bit of disconnect of signals. And, a lot of purees also are fruit focused or carb focused, and they don't have ample fat. and definitely don't have ample protein. So I believe starting with baby-led weaning and starting right away. Stella's first food was avocado, and she played with avocado for 4 weeks until she actually successfully, I mean, like she probably had a 16th of a teaspoon in the first couple days because it's just like going over here and she's figuring out what to do with it. But I knew that when she got hungry enough, aside from the supplemental breast milk, that she'd figure out how to do that work. And from there, we expanded to salmon was her second food. Then we went grass-fed burger patty. And then she had coconut oil because I was using that actually with breastfeeding, like for mastitis. You use that topically a lot. And so we kind of just opened up the world from there. Berries came next, and then sweet potato roasted in coconut oil. So, one of my big philosophies is start them savory, allow them to have autonomy of meaning when they put the food to their mouth, that means they're ready to eat, and then as they grow and develop, give them autonomy with decision-making process. So when we're making dinner, we'll ask Stella, we're making burger patties. Would you like burger or salmon for your protein? And we teach her starting at age 18 months to 2 years, we started teaching her what a protein was, and not in a boring way of, hey kid, here's some flashcards, but in conversation of, this is a protein. This is why we eat this. So this is the protein choice you have. And this is your vegetable choice. And so I give guided decision-making process. So she still has ownership. And we do that with the way we pack her lunches for school. And it really transpires. It's funny. We were sitting at dinner a couple weeks ago, and she was eating steak. It was a grass-fed steak, of course, with some broccoli and I think sweet potato. And she asked for more sweet potato. And I was like, oh, are you feeling hungry? And she said, yeah, mama. And I go, okay, well, how about you have a couple more bites of your steak? Because that may be a little bit more nourishing. And she goes, because it's a protein, like a carnivore dinosaur. And I was like, yes, like, it's like, in her own, she's getting things though. And I think it's just super cool to empower them. And I still gave her the sweet potato, but I gave her the opportunity to think through the process and to understand what the foods on her plate have purpose for.
That's amazing. I love that. I love that advice because so many times, like I've just seen it with friends, family members, children are just like, oh, they ask for something and then immediately it's just like, I don't want to deal with them. So that way they're not complaining or crying. I'm just going to give them ice cream or this candy or this sugar. And I'm like, oh gosh, you're creating these habits. And it's interesting because I know something you talk a lot about and you touched on it. And I was just reading a paper the other day and it made me think of you because it was about women who consume sucralose while they're breastfeeding. And they basically found they looked in blood at the women who were breastfeeding who were consuming artificial sweeteners, and they found the traces of it obviously in the baby. And they looked like later on, and like the baby's preferences for sweet foods was a lot higher because they were having that sweetness come from the breast milk. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is like right down what Allie talks about. Like this is her alley. That's so crazy, and how that preference like develops at an early age. And so some of the tips that you just gave were amazing.
I think a part of it is these foods are still wired as reward and celebratory foods, regardless of even the source of sweet, but just sweetened foods in general. And Maura and I have a really similar perspective on this in the sense of we're like, my husband, he'll even say to me, he's like, oh, but don't you feel bad for her, Al? Like, we should give her something normal. She should have a squeeze pack. And I looked at him and I'm like, she gets F-bomb packs. Like she gets nut butter packs. That's the closest thing to a squeeze pack that she's going to get, because no, I don't feel bad for her. I'm empowering her and I'm supporting her up for the most success cognitively, emotionally, metabolically. And I feel very strong in that stance. It's not about food freedom of letting them be normal. I think that we should all start to educate ourselves, and we should all shift the conversation of stop feeding children chemical garbage. Stop feeding children fake food, and stop overburdening them with carbohydrates that are setting them up for fatty liver at age 8. I mean, it's really, I think, food should be seen as a freedom in the sense that you make decisions that allow your body to perform at its maximum capacity. That's food freedom. That's empowering yourself with food. Eating things that are going to create disruption within the signaling of your body, to me, is imprisoning that little one in their body and then medicating them when they're not listening and concentrating and focusing. And it's just, yeah, it's something I'm only going to get louder about.
I love it. I love that. And, I was talking with Suzanne Ryan the other day as well. And I love seeing moms who are being louder about this conversation. Like, she sent me a picture of her daughter's school lunches and like what they offered. And she's like, look at this, how crazy this is. Like, very little protein, virtually no fat, and just all carbohydrates. And she goes to like a private school. Like, it's supposed to be like really good, really top notch. And she's like, I'm going to talk with the principal like right now, because even though she's like, I'm going to supply the food for her, but like, there should be options, because there's all these kids who are going there, and this is what you're setting them up for failure. And we wonder why the obesity epidemic, we can't even call it adult onset diabetes anymore, because children are developing it. It's like we're providing these things and we're not giving them the option to, other than their parents being educated, to go forth and make these decisions.
Yeah, so true.
Amazing. So I want to jump into the other topic that you talked about, which is like with diet, the effect that it has on the mind. Because I think a lot of people, like, anxiety is one piece, but going along with that, there's like, you have ADHD, you have depression, you have people who are dealing with some of these challenges on a daily basis. What are your thoughts on that?
So I believe that food is medicine and food is information. And, when we're looking at the food as medicine perspective, it's both abundance and restriction. So it's kind of this pendulum. It's removing pro-inflammatory foods that either directly interfere with receptors in the brain. For instance, gluten and dairy interfere with our opioid receptors. So there's a compound actually called caseomorphin, and it has morphine-like influence in the casein protein in dairy, and gluteomorphin, which has morphine-like influence. So we can get irritability, short fuse, addictive tendencies. Then there's foods that are pro-inflammatory that can have, impact on inflammation in general. So whether that's gut disruption or whether that's just creating a low-grade elevated CRP, which is, a marker of inflammation in the body, we see that being a huge disease risk factor across the board. And when we look at mental illness or just cognitive optimization, on either end of the spectrum, we know that CRP tends to trend also with mood disturbances. I like to think of it as, your neurotransmitters are trying to send these signals in this communication pathway. And it's like this beautiful symphony that's supposed to have this balance of both the excitatory and the inhibitory compounds. And if you're in a state of low-grade inflammation, there's going to be a lot more of that excitatory impact. So your body's figuring out something's wrong. What is it? And it starts to put out epinephrine or adrenaline. And so you have this just kind of low-grade level of unease. And so I look to limit inflammatory foods. And then I really hone in on the microbiome, because we know that our enteric nervous system, which is the second brain of the body in our gut, that has more neurons than the central nervous system of the spine and the brain combined. That's pretty wild. And we're like just starting to kind of tip into what impacts the microbiome and the production of neurotransmitters, how those that are made in the gut may not cross the blood-brain barrier, but how it's this bilateral communication between the gut and the brain, and how that can still influence either that stress, fight or flight response, or this regulatory grounded mode. So I really feel that both by restricting pro-inflammatory foods, and the ones I highlight are gluten, dairy, corn, soy, and sugar, and all of their byproducts included, and then having an abundance of supporting foods that are anti-inflammatory or particularly rich in amino acids that support a particular neurotransmitter or boost the microbiome, that is going to enhance not only our cognitive function, but our stress resilience. And I think, unfortunately, in today's age, a lot of us feel just at this kind of wiry electric mode or burnout mode on a constant level. It's either like wind me up, shut me down. And my whole goal with this is just really trying to get people to establish a grounded mental place where they're able to function from their space of really their true self, and not feeling constantly reactive, but feeling more regulated.
Love that. And going along with what you said on some of those anti-inflammatory foods, what are some of those that you recommend?
Yeah, so in each kind of R approach, so I have 6 primary R's, which is reduce inflammation, reset the microbiome, repair the gut lining, restore micronutrients, and then rebound the adrenals and rebalance neurotransmitters. So in each of those, there's abundant foods. So like, for example, in what was the first R? I don't even, removing inflammation or reducing inflammation. I have anti-inflammatory compounds highlighted, so we're looking at things like turmeric as a highlighted food. We're looking at, in the microbiome chapter, fermented vegetables like pickles and krauts. We're looking at, in the rebounding neurotransmitters mode, foods like matcha that are rich in L-theanine that actually help the alpha brainwaves, which is really when our alpha brainwaves are optimized, that puts us in this creative, concentrated focus without that agitation, anxiety. It's what's seen during REM cycles of sleep, and also alpha brainwaves are peaked during deep meditation. So each element within there, and then, rebounding adrenals might have high dose vitamin C, because of all of the storage tissue in our body. We store the most vitamin C in our tiny adrenal glands, and they regulate our cortisol, as does magnesium. So I may suggest something like, 3 cups of leafy greens for the magnesium and the folate, and then adding in zest of citrus as well as citrus juice for that vitamin C. And that's going to act in activating those minerals, adding acid to the greens, but also you're getting that synergy effect of the nutrients.
I love your scientific approach to eat. And I'm excited to dive into some of the recipes that you have in there, because everything that you talk about, like you just talked about, it's like this science of like, you add this in to bring this out. And most people don't think like that. They're just like, oh, I'm just going to have spinach, or I'm just going to have, but you create these phenomenal combinations that are done with purpose, right? Not only flavorful, but there's purpose behind them. I love that.
Yes, we've been doing that for years, and it's interesting. There's other elements, like when we add acid to greens, we turn the iron from a ferric to ferrous form. And yes, still not as bioavailable iron that we'd get in a heme form from red meat, which is my top recommendation for iron, of course. But there's always a method to the madness, if you will. And I always find in everything, following ancestral trends is usually the way to go. I mean, so when we're looking at foods, it's like, again, don't feed your kids something that your great grandparents didn't eat. That's probably not a food, and it probably doesn't belong in their body.
Exactly right. Now, one of the questions I get all the time, and I want to get your insight on, because a lot of people have that low grade, that we talked about, that low grade inflammation and how that can contribute to some neurological deficits, so to speak. You're not optimizing neurological function with wherever you're at, whatever you're trying to do. One of those is dairy, but one of my questions is, with dairy, is it all forms of dairy, or do you see it's mainly with cow's dairy?
Casein, and it's the A1. So that's a great question. I'd love to unpack that further. So that's kind of the big movement now with the A2 casein that you'll see in goat is A2, for instance. And now there's certain, forms of dairy milk that you can get in the grocery store that's A2 only. It's the Holsteins, which is like the black and white cow. Those are the ones that have a higher milk yield, and those are A1. But like the Guernsey and the Jersey, more brown cows, and that's not always a thing, but based on the genetics of the animal, basically, is going to be whether it's an A1 or an A2 casein. And so we don't see that opioid effect with whey. We don't see that opioid effect specifically with lactose. It's with casein, and seen higher in an A1, which is more of that conventional mass-produced dairy that we see in the States. And that's why also they'll say that dairy can have different effect, like gluten as well, which has higher gliadin concentration in the States than in other countries as well. And what's interesting to even take that a little bit further is we are more susceptible to the effects of casein when we have an unoptimal gut hydrochloric acid status, or the acidity of our gut. So when the gut becomes a little bit too basic from use of over-the-counter Tums or Pepcid or PPI drugs, whether they're prescribed like omeprazole or over-the-counter Nexium or you name it, we're buffering that acidity that not only aids in our activation of breakdown of proteins and activation of many nutrients, but that also works as a chemical defender against bacteria overgrowth, as well as helping to break down some of these inflammatory compounds. So we see like use of digestive enzyme that has HCl in it that can somewhat mitigate the effect of casein. And some people will notice less inflammation, like in the joint pain, people that deal with severe joint pain with dairy, when they use a digestive enzyme with HCl. And then furthermore, if they're selecting a product that's casein free, like ghee or a clean grass-fed whey or an A2 product, they're likely not going to have the effects either.
Amazing. That's great tips, because it's one of the biggest questions I always get is on the dairy aspect. Like you said, a lot of it has to deal with the type of protein, like the A1 versus A2. I love that. So that's great. When we're talking about women's health, you deal with a lot of women who are really just not only just working on their hormonal levels, but just optimizing their health and function. How do you approach, and we'll talk, like when we're talking about keto, because I think, like you said, a lot of times people pigeonhole keto and say there's only one way to do it. You have to do it my way or the highway. But I agree with a lot of what you say with like, oh, there needs to be some fluidity to this. How do you approach that with most women with like a focus on their hormonal and just overall health of how to be fluid with like a lower carbohydrate, higher fat approach?
Yeah. Can I explain, like to set the foundation, allostatic load, or is that way off topic?
No, love it.
Okay. Because I think that that's what happens in women.
Yep.
And so, there's this concept, allostatic load or allostasis. And basically what it means is how a stressor that's generally seen as a positive stressor has beneficial influence in the body. So like, what is your resilience or upper capacity for the stressors that you take on? And I like to compare allostatic load to like a wardrobe for women, especially. It's fun to compare because, you can only fit so many clothes in your closet. So when the season changes and you want to bring something else in, you got to figure out what you get rid of. And so I see this time and time again, especially in our communities, where people start feeling good, like they get into keto and they start getting that keto high, and then they're like, okay, they start following different health leaders and forward thinkers and biohackers, and they start layering on these other allostatic stressors. So then they're like, okay, I'm going to do a sauna. Okay, I'm going to pick up my weightlifting at the gym. Okay, I'm going to intermittent fast. And then I might not sleep because I'm not tired, or I'm going to take on I'm going to take on the PTA lead role at school for my kids and revamp their school lunch program. They just kind of take, add. And the wardrobe is, really beyond full. And this is what I see in women often. I'm, a 35-year-old woman running a functional medicine clinic, just put out another book, and I have a 3-year-old. So I'm that classic type A, give me all the hurdles and I'll just keep running and jumping. And so what I like to kind of take a step back and think of is, with any of those health supporting behaviors, if you think of lifting weights is probably the easiest comparison. If you had a 10 pound weight and you did 30 reps as a female, you're going to start to get some muscle gains. If you did that for 20 minutes nonstop, you're going to start to get some atrophy. If a gun was held to your head and you did it for 2 hours, you would have severe atrophy, right? And at that point, that is no longer beneficial to your allostatic load. That's just tipped you over into dysfunction, and that's going to drive more inflammatory process than your body can heal, right? So any health behavior, and I say that very clearly, can be overdone. We could say the same thing to fasting, right? If an individual is watching their clock and they're white knuckling and their stomach's growling during meetings, like, dude, eat something.
Right.
Like, don't just follow a protocol that someone told you to do. And so I find that to be the caveat. I think that the ketogenic diet as a constant state of nutritional ketosis can be balancing for women. I don't feel that every woman, because of their anatomy, has to carb cycle, but I bring in carb cycling as a tool for individuals that run low leptin. And leptin ties into allostatic load because leptin is a hormone. In Greek, it translates to thin, and it's a satiety hormone. So when leptin is optimized, we feel satiated. We don't experience hunger. That's from that ghrelin hormone, right? So we don't experience as much irritability, hunger, short fuse. Also, when leptin is optimized, we have less inflammation, and we also tend to have deeper quality sleep and more parasympathetic balance. And that's because we have leptin receptors on our hypothalamus, which is where they're primary docked, as well as our thyroid, as well as our ovaries. So over time, if an individual is taking on too many stressors, leptin starts to get depleted. And if we entered into keto at a state of insulin resistance, like we had increased body fat and our insulin levels were elevated, just as insulin resistance starts to become sensitized, leptin levels start to get optimized. But every woman has a sweet spot of what creates from leptin optimization to leptin depletion. And generally speaking, leptin levels are produced by body fat stores as well as fat consumption in the diet. So for my type A crazy person, using myself as the example, there often are days that, I'll realize I have to ebb and flow with my fasting approach. And I often have to do a fat fast, which means I need to have that coconut oil and that ghee in my morning coffee. Otherwise, I have a hard time getting in enough nutrient density throughout my day. And that's the tipping point for me of whether fasting is supportive or harmful. And I find also that because I am running on ketones and I have amazing energy and cognitive clarity, that I often forget to eat. And so sometimes my 2 square meals don't fill up enough of the leptin, and I run lower percent body fat. So I find for me that at days 19 and 20 of my menstrual cycle, I will do a targeted carb up, and that actually will reset my leptin stores because leptin is insulinogenic. So I'm actually intentionally getting an insulin peak with a glucose peak to get a little reset on my body so that my body says, okay, Allie's fed, she's safe. Now we can get back into keto and burn. But it's this little blip in the radar that works for my body. I've had other women that are able to be lower stress than me, that are able to stay just tight keto and don't need to do that carb cycling, but they generally also are fueling themselves with more fat that doesn't work for me and my body.
Amazing. So some questions on that.
Yeah, sorry, that was a big rant.
No, this is great because I know there's a lot of people who are interested in this. How do, other than, is the main way to test for leptin levels blood? How else, is that what you recommend to patients or people just go get their leptin levels tested?
Yes, and I can give you symptoms of low leptin. So there's symptoms you can look for, but yes, leptin can be run through LabCorp and Quest, which are the 2, big name labs. It is a functional lab, but it is available mainstream. So it's good to know that that's available. And I always recommend running kind of a little metabolic, especially if you're curious on your hormone impact of that metabolic factor. You can run your adiponectin, your leptin, your fasting insulin, your hemoglobin A1C, and a CRP, and that's at least a good starting point. There's, of course, tons of other functional labs, but that's a good point. Leptin depletion is the opposite of that keto high. So with leptin depletion, you're going to start to experience hunger. Like all of a sudden, you're feeling like, well, what happened to my discipline? Is it just the pumpkin spice lattes everywhere, or am I truly hungry? And you're going to start to be that guy in the boardroom whose stomach is grumbling all of a sudden out of the blue when it wasn't before. So hunger will pick up when leptin drops low. We'll also see a little bit more anxiety, irritability, like a bitiness. If you're feeling a little bit more irritable, and we can see insomnia pick up as well. And then we can see a little bit more irregular or heart rate variability, because we can even get a little bit of almost palpitations. The body, when leptin drops too low, it starts to go into more of a survival mode. And so it perceives sometimes fasting and calorie restriction as a stressor versus a benefit. The keto diet itself, I would say, is not. But again, it's assuming that you're getting enough fat and eating enough with it.
Right. And one of the things that's really good to look for those signs. And I see a lot in people who are in this community that are overweight. You tend to see that leptin resistance. So it's like insulin resistance. They might have leptin, but like they're resistant to it. It's knocking on the cell store and it's not opening. And so that they're always hungry all the time. And that's,
Yes.
it's one of the things I've talked about before. I actually talked about it on the podcast with my brother. That's frustrating because I think a lot of times people just say, hey, it's easy as just put the fork down. And you're like, there's a lot of hormonal aspects that are going on. Like his leptin isn't responding the same as someone else's. There's other changes that need to take place. So do you see that a lot in your practice?
Absolutely. And so my interventions for leptin resistance or elevated leptin levels is to do a prolonged fast or more intermittent fasting. And then if they were doing a fat fast, they'd take the fat out of their beverage, right? So there's no one stop. Everyone's unique. You got to kind of adjust. And then I ensure that they're sleeping. That's a huge priority because leptin is optimized based on getting quality, restful sleep. Again, it's a safety mechanism of your body. So for some reason, and it could be just from a, physiological, from the body fat. So that's where the fasting and calorie restriction part would help. But reducing stress and helping with sleep is big. And then omega-3 fatty acid supplementation. So I do 2 grams of a combo of EPA, DHA to support when there's leptin resistance.
Amazing. And I want to touch on another thing that you said, because there's a lot of questions on this with the carb up. And I know everyone's different. What does that look like for you? Like, what is like, are you going and eating copious amounts of rice and candy, or like what is your carb up look like?
And not A2 ice cream. No, just kidding. Extra casein and sugar. No, so I believe that it should still be anti-inflammatory. I mean, the reason to do this, if that works for you, would be to, again, give the body signals that it's safe. So the last thing you'd want to do with a carb up is stress the body out and eat a bunch of processed garbage. That's a total radical shift from your norm. So for me, it is still staying paleo, and it is just incorporating a larger amount of a starchy vegetable. I may chop up I might do like bacon wrapped dates, which is one of my favorite things to do. And then I'll drizzle balsamic and roast them in the oven. Each date has like 12 grams of carbs. So it's pretty, and for me, a carb up is generally, for most people, I say 30 to max 45 grams above your norm, because everyone has a different starting norm. So my norm ranges between 20 to 35 grams of carbs a day. So a carb up for me might look like somewhere between 50 to 75 grams or something like that. And I like to position the carbs in the evening because that's also when you're not going to have as much metabolic activity. That's when we're going to get more of that impact. And we do get a little bit of a serotonin boost when we have the carbohydrates in the evening. So I find it leads to a really deep, restful sleep. And that next morning, for me personally, although I typically fat fast, I wake up so satiated that I will do an actual clean 16-8 where I won't eat until noon. And that's just organic for me. It's not like I'm following a guideline. It's just like, I can't even understand what hunger is. Right. Whereas the other mornings I'm like ready for that fatty coffee and it feels right in my system.
And so how many days do you do? Like one or two?
So I follow based on, for me, hormone. And the biggest indication that I get if I miss a carb up is my menstrual cycle is anovulatory, meaning that I don't ovulate. And I don't think there's been enough research on this, but from my deductive reasoning and the science and the understanding of the body that I have, I think that that's a protective mechanism because my leptin is suppressed and my body says her body's not safe to have a child. So why would we ovulate? That's my perspective. And I find that when I do these strategic carb ups that I ovulate. So that's the only check and balance that I can see. So when I carb up is going to be at days 1 and 2 of my cycle. And basically leptin follows your follicular and luteinizing hormone trends. So I've looked in research studies of when leptin is at the highest demand. So if an individual is running low, when would be the best times to kind of pick that up? And it's generally about 4 to 5 days post ovulation and then at the start of the cycle. So it's about 4 days of the month in general. And I am intuitive with it. What's so interesting now is, I mean, I used to use like a tracker, and I would like have to mark my calendar. And now I'll be like eating dinner with my family and I'll be like, oh, dude, those Yukon smashed potatoes look really good. 'Cause Brady will like roast some, purple potatoes and Yukon potatoes with fresh rosemary and whatnot. And I'll be like, oh, and I'll like start eating one. I'll be like, yeah, that feels really good. And then I'll like glance at my phone. I'm like, I'm curious where I'm at. Oh, day 19. What do you know? I'll have 3 of those. And so it's just a really, the body, I think, as soon as we can wring out inflammation and we can start to connect to the signals and we can listen to the feedback, that it really becomes a very natural process.
I love that. And I love that you mentioned the fact that, like, because that's a big question, is how should I carb up? And like, I love the bacon wrapped dates idea. That sounds delicious. And but like, a lot of people just go out and just blow it out. Like, they'll go and they'll have like fast food, pizza and cake and that. And like you said, like, you just spent a large majority of your month doing anti-inflammatory foods, and you're going to come in and like douse it with inflammation, and you're like, that's not the type of carb up we were talking about.
That's not the intention and purpose. Yeah. I don't know how safe my body would feel. My body would be like danger.
Yeah, so much danger. No, that's great. What now, what are your thoughts? Do you see, or have you heard or worked with, I know a lot of it's with female and working with their cycle. Do you see anything similar with males?
So with men, I have seen when the signs of leptin depletion again, and less men, I will say, test low leptin when I'm running. I run it within a cardiometabolic panel that I run. But maybe that's because I have a larger population of women as well. So, I haven't looked statistically within that. But I think that because there are leptin receptors on our ovaries, that there's definitely, and women are meant to have higher percent body fat, that there's definitely more of an influence on women. But I will say, I particularly had a man who's a high-powered attorney. He was doing some biohacking. So he was doing ice baths and doing he had started doing some 48-hour and then 72-hour, excuse me, not day, 48 to 72-hour fasts, and had like a very low percent body fat. I want to say like 8 or something like that. And he said, he emailed me the second night of his planned 3-day fast and said, I've been up shaking in my bed. I'm thinking of calling a friend. And then the next day I ended up calling him and I was like, dude, what's going on? He's like, my body was shaking. I was like, because your body is starving. Like, your body is telling you that it does not like this. So I think, again, there can be, and then there's someone else who is 300 pounds and would do a beautiful 4-day fast with salt, so it's different scenarios. And I told him, I said, dude, the only time your body could tolerate a fast like that is if you have your legs up on the beach and your body feels safe to get into that autophagy process. But right now, when you're firing neurons and you're running your brain and you're working with a caseload and you're trying to exercise and ice bath and do all these, your body's like literally freaking out. It's telling you it doesn't feel safe. And so that's kind of, honestly, with the work of anxiety diet, that's kind of my big jam, is like everything. I feel that we all are in survival mode. And what can we do to get the body into that parasympathetic, safe, regulatory place? Because if we fire in reactive mode, the last thing we want to do is stimulate more reactions in the body.
100%. And I think we've touched on so many aspects. I think diet's one of those aspects, like the foods that you eat's one of them. You touched on sleep. What are some of the things that you like? Because that's one of my areas that I stink at. Like, I'm horrible at it, but I work at it. Like magnesium, blackout curtains. I try and stay off my phone and computer as much as possible, but you know how difficult that is. Yeah. Like blue light blockers. What are some of the other things that you recommend for like really helping with sleep for people to optimize that?
So you just named some really good ones, and I would just highlight on the magnesium glycinate or bisglycinate. And what's unique about that form of magnesium that a lot of people don't know, we think of magnesium as the ultimate chill pill, but magnesium actually crosses the blood-brain barrier. And so it actually works as a bodyguard and protects the brain-blood barrier from excessive epinephrine or adrenaline crossing. So that's pretty powerful right there. And then magnesium also directly hits the pituitary, and it downregulates ACTH, which is the hormone stimulant to cortisol release. So magnesium actually downregulates cortisol release from your adrenals, and it blocks that neurotransmitter of stress response. And I think, like I said, we talk about do some magnesium, but you really like, I really always want people to like know it's really, really powerful. And so I really believe that you should pulse magnesium up during times of higher stress demand. And so you might have a baseline of 200 to 400 milligrams, but it could easily be appropriate to at times go upwards of, over 1,000 to 2 grams, would be totally appropriate depending on the individual stress demand and where their cortisol status is at. So I think that that's a fantastic thing to be mindful of. And yes, I love all of the like sleep hygiene things and how to block the blue light, because blue light burns out our dopamine.
Right.
So, there's direct neurotransmitter impact from that. And, when dopamine is burned out, that's when at 6 p.m. we come home from the office and we open the pantry or the freezer looking for that food coma to refill that dopamine. And the issue is that the fat mixed with sweet, which is what we go for dopamine, and the fast food industry knows this. That's why, McDonald's fries adds sugar to their salt blend. The combination of fat and sugar, it does create a dopamine spike and it maintains dopamine elevation, but it doesn't restore dopamine production. So we're creating this addiction without, resolution or without, upstream refeeding the tank. And so, for instance, with my clients, if I know they run low dopamine and you burn through dopamine more, not only with blue light, but also stress. So if it's just a high stress day, we might work with like L-tyrosine, which is a direct amino acid building block to make dopamine. Or we may work with GABA, which is going to mitigate as an inhibitory compound, the stress response, so that when the individual gets to their house, they don't go into that autopilot mode, or they don't have to white knuckle and then work with harmful thoughts of how they're failing, which I think is a big piece too, our mind. But yeah, so giving them those tools to support those depleted states.
Amazing. And I want to before we jump into the book and some of that mind piece, because I think there's so much incredibleness that you talk about beyond just the diet. What are some practical tips? What would be steps? Like, say someone comes to you, and I know there's a lot of context that you would need to find out, but what are some of the things, just tips for people who are dealing with any type of mental health? They're dealing with, what are some of those things to help get that under control and at least move them in the right direction? Before they go all in, what are some of the main tips you could recommend?
Yeah. And so one of the first things I do is try to ensure the individual is getting enough protein, because even in the ketogenic diet, a lot of people are protein malnourished. And especially if you've had successful weight loss results, because it's this, you may have achieved your weight where now you need to refeed, and you're still at this calorie restricted state. And so often I'll see the brain fog, chronic fatigue, memory issues, muscle aches, of course, is a little bit more connected, and hair loss. Those, the first thing I go for is protein. Are you getting enough protein? Right. And it's important when we're talking about mental health, because our amino acids, which are, protein derived compounds, are the building blocks of our neurotransmitters. And so just as I was mentioning, L-tyrosine, that's found in poultry, that's found in dark meat poultry, that's found in eggs. And so, for instance, if you're doing a food as medicine snack at that 4 or 5 p.m. time, to have a sheet of nori and put some avocado on that with some in-house roasted turkey and roll it up and do a really simple sushi bite. Super simple, literally no work. That's going to really set you up for optimized dopamine stores. So there's tweaks like that I offer in my book that give really simple strategy. But the power of protein is important, even going back full circle for children. I really ensure all kiddos starting at age 3 get 15 grams of protein at all meals, which is a minimum of 2 ounces. And it sounds so easy. And my Stella can house a 5-ounce piece of salmon like it's no business. But a lot of kids aren't getting that. And a lot of adults aren't getting their protein need, which I usually say, about a gram per kilogram of body weight on average as a guesstimation. And so for listeners, to convert pounds into kilograms, it's just your pounds divided by 2.2. And that's at least a good safe base. And then you may need to up that from there.
Love those recommendations. I couldn't agree more, because I've been seeing a lot lately, especially with people who are doing like OMAD, like 1 meal a day. I get worried about that because they're not getting enough. Like, a lot of them are eating like 15. These are adults and they're eating 15 grams of protein in their meal, and you're like, you need more, and their hair starts falling out. They're getting keto rash. And a big one that I've had a lot of conversations with is vegans and vegetarians. Their protein source is inadequate. Like, they don't have a lot of good amino acids. And right. Like, if they want to choose that way for whatever reason they're going, like, you need to supplement. Like, it's not even I should. It's like, you absolutely need to, because the sources of protein, and really a ketogenic one's like tofu for most people, is like you need those essential amino acids that just aren't there. They're not there in those vegan or vegetarian protein sources if you're not eating meat, and you need to get those in. You need to, in order to thrive and be successful on whatever you're trying to do.
Absolutely. And I mean, in my anti-anxiety diet book, I actually talk about my process as a recovering vegan. And really, the first panic attack I ever had happened during a timestamp that I was raw vegan, which is just the epitome of anti-nutrients. Yeah. A lot of anti-nutrients. And I was trying to eat what I thought was the healthiest food on the planet, And so obviously I've learned and evolved. But beyond protein and bioavailability, there's other therapeutics that you just can't get. I have people ask me all the time, can I do the anti-anxiety diet vegetarian or vegan? And I'll say pescatarian, maybe. Right. But I don't, yes, you can do keto, but you can't do my anti-anxiety diet because it's soy-free. So there goes your tofu and tempeh. Right. And I want you to have collagen and gelatin, and you can only get those from animal products. You could do marine collagen, and you could make dashi, fish broth. And that's why I say that's the only, that's where I'll go. The buck stops there. So I need you eating eggs. I need you getting choline. Choline is such a beautiful nutrient for our brain. Acetylcholine is converted from it. And that's like the transductor of all of our neurotransmitters. So it's the, orchestra lead of the symphony. And choline plays a huge role in lubricating our neurological system so that the signals fire more rapidly. And we just see with brain fog, memory, cognitive decline, any form of brain impact, that choline deficiency is widely seen.
Very, very big. I love choline, and that's why I always encourage people to eat the yolk. Stop being around the yolk. So I want to jump into the book. I'm super excited about this, and I'm even more excited because I got to have one of your recipes in person, and I had these balls. That sounds weird, but I had, yes, they were delicious. First off, can you tell us what they were, what was in the, and like, again, this is another one of your concoctions that like has things in it. It's not just like this tastes delicious. It's like, no, it's metabolically sound and healthy for you. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a dream come true.
And you were wearing a continuous glucose monitor at that time.
I was.
And the recipe had honey in it, and it didn't kick you out of ketosis. So it just further stamps my, whole food keto approach. Because I remember looking at you and being like, hey, how's it looking? Yeah. They're called lemon lavender CBD balls. And the base of them are macadamia nut and Brazil nut. So, of course, we're going for a high-fat base, and we add in copious amounts of coconut oil, just enough so that they set in the freezer, and then coconut butter. So that's kind of the foundation of it. And, of course, the Brazil nuts for selenium and the mineral density there. And then I zest lemons, and so you're getting those bioflavonoids, high vitamin C boost. And then we use fresh lavender in there that I break down with the lemon zest. And lavender itself is a nervine. So it's a very calming agent for our neurological system. It helps us, again, to get to that kind of safe place. And then the vitamin C, as I mentioned earlier, is a good supporter for adrenal regulation. I think those are the big highlights in the recipe. And then of course, I use a little bit of honey. But in perspective of this, and when I talk about, again, metabolic flexibility, the whole recipe, I believe it has multiple cups of the nuts. It has at least a quarter cup of coconut oil plus a quarter cup of coconut butter and all those other things. And it uses 1.5 tablespoons of honey, right? So it's like, the macros are like, 25 grams of fat to 2 carbs, or something like that. So it's laughable, I think. But mark my words, I will, when I post these things, I'll have people comment and say, oh, but I'll have to sub something out for that honey because it's not keto. And I'm like, dude, no, you're not getting it.
Exactly right. And so beyond amazing, delicious recipes, because I know there's going to be a ton in there. I know you also talk about mindset, and that's a big piece, and one that we tend to just focus on diet, exercise, but like, what can readers, like, when they get this, what can they expect to understand from like the way you approach mindset and how that factors into this entire equation?
Yeah, I think that that's a huge piece of this puzzle, because that in itself, the way that you speak to yourself, your subconscious or your inner voice, the kindness or harmful attitude and language that you give to yourself in the silent space itself serves as a chronic stressor or a regulator. And I work with clients all the time with kind of what I call downloading the cassette tape. And what the reference is, and now I have all these millennials, and I'm like, okay, it's this thing with these wheels. Like, this is what a cassette tape looks like. I need a new analogy, man. But anyway, it's downloading the cassette tape, and basically the concept of that is that we've been recording the feedback that we've received throughout as many years that we've been alive, right? And unfortunately, how many of us in our successes see the failures louder? You may lose 32 pounds, but you regained 4, and you just obsess about those 4. And I shouldn't have done this, and you're shooting all over yourself, and you're second guessing, and you're ruminating instead of seeing the victor element of where you're at in your life. And so I work with clients to download some of the negative thought patterns, especially if they're aware of them in particular thoughts. And they can be as simple as, I don't know what the heck I'm doing. Or, someone who's walking into their nursing job and frustrated with their position, or whatever it is. And really reframing those to be at least neutral. And then even playing with teasing out positivity. And for some people, positivity can feel a little bit forced, as for instance, to say from, I don't know what I'm doing, to a neutral statement would be, this isn't my passion, but this is my present. Like, that's a very clean, like, you don't have to feel positive. You're acknowledging that this isn't your passion, but you're also acknowledging that this is your present. And you're at least taking away the negativity of that statement. And, then taking it positive would be, I am in a journey and I'm open to what the universe provides, or whatever, right? Yeah. So even more a little bit out there. And so kind of whatever works with my client, we'll work on some of this reframing. And then I do a lot of work with mantra as well. And with mantra, it's about intentional, purposeful language that you are trying to really bathe the body with. And I compare it to also weightlifting in the sense of, you have to build the muscle. You have to create this effect where it's almost osmotic, where you're not even thinking, but your mantra is being said to you. And so mantra can be something very simple, and it can change and evolve. It could be scripture if someone is spiritual and wants to incorporate their religion with it. But for me, one of my mantras is, I choose this stress. This is passion manifest. And that's a really positive one for me, because I could feel like, I have so many things going on. Right? It could go off. And it's just this, when I'm stressed out, I just say, I choose this stress. This is passion manifest. And it just feels different. It's more empowering. It puts me back in the driver's seat of my life. And that in itself rewrites the perspective of how I go through my day, and how I look at every opportunity as a blessing and something that I've worked for that is manifesting, versus something that I have to do.
Oh, that's powerful. That's so incredible. And I'm excited to dive all into this book and understand beyond just the diet. I love the aspect that you talk about the mental component, because I think so many people get wrapped up in a lot of that negative self-talk. They lose perspective. They lose, and they get so hung up on the scale or the number, or things aren't moving, and they lost 15 pounds and they're frustrated that they didn't lose 20, and they lose sight of how far they've come. And they want more and more. And that's good to have hunger to kind of want to keep growing, but understand, like, you've done incredible. Like, you're on a journey. And I think reframing that and getting people to see it from that perspective is such a powerful, powerful tool.
I really believe that healing can only come from a place of self-love. You can't hate yourself into healing. You just can't do that. And so it's like, it's like into a family member, your body, right? So there's parts of it that you love more than others. There's parts of it that work better for you than others. And there's parts of it that frustrate the heck out of you, but you still have to love it. And I think that that's a really important piece, because we talk about positivity being important, but I think also what for some people need to hear is how harmful negativity is.
Right.
And, that's not really discussed a lot. I was shocked when I was doing research on, I just did like a little Instagram, whatever that's TV thing on my channel. And I was talking about this concept of the nocebo effect. And the word nocebo, it literally means to harm. And there was a research study done where they did a saline IV drip. Saline, right? So totally harmless. And they told the individuals in the study that it was chemo, and that they were doing this impact on chemo without cancer, and that they were going to do a couple treatments and just see how their body responded. Well, 60+% of the people retched and vomited from the saline. And this is the shocking part. That's like, okay, like that's a remarkable mind-body connection, but this is the shocker. About 30% lost their hair. Like,
that's crazy.
How do you will hair loss? Like that is just like mind-blowing to me.
Yep.
And so if you can think of that negative association of this is a harmful substance coming into me, and then actually lose hair, think of what happens when you say, negative thoughts on a daily basis to yourself.
Oh, wow. That's so true. So powerful. Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I want, actually I have one last question. I didn't ask you this last time. This is a question that I ask everyone at the end of the show now, is at the end of the day, when it's your time and your time on this planet is up, what legacy do you want to leave? Like, what do you want people to remember Ali Miller by? Like, what's that legacy that you want to have?
I think that food is here to empower us, and that we shouldn't be overburdened with it. We shouldn't feel victimized by it, that we should be able to use it as a tool to empower us. And I hope that my Food as Medicine mission really provides that platform for people to understand at least the connections of how food is information for their own body, and then how to adjust their body accordingly.
Very powerful. So where can people find your new book? Where can they find you on social if they're not already following you? Where can they find that stuff?
Yeah, so everything's really simple under Ali Miller RD. So it's just ALIMILLER-RD. And so my website's alimillerrd.com. All my social handles are at alimillerrd. And you can get the book everywhere, really. I mean, you can buy it on my website, but it's on Amazon. It's at Barnes & Noble. It's where books are sold, I think is the statement.
Awesome.
Where books are sold. And I always recommend, go to your local bookstore and purchase it if they have it. It's always great to vote with your dollar, because a dollar you spend within your community really circulates.
Love that. That's amazing. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming back on. You're amazing, and you're going to continue changing people's lives for years to come. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian. It's my pleasure. It's always a fun time.
Thanks, guys. All right, guys. Stay tuned. We'll have more for you. Make sure you go check out Ali and her new book, and we'll talk to you soon.